Well, at the time of the Revolutionary War, England had the mightiest navy the world had ever seen, a farmable army, and an economy that was unmatched by any other. So how does a ragtag army of revolutionaries prevail? Well, that is where Clark Musser picks up our story.
So England, with its combination of military and economic prowess, was, in today's lexicon, what we would say the mightiest superpower in the world. George Washington, as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, was the commander-in-chief of an army of one. There was no Continental Army. There were no officers, there were no soldiers, no cannon, muskets, no uniforms, blankets. There were no shoes. There wasn't even money to pay for the creation of that army. There was simply the promises of representatives from all 13 colonies that they would provide the manpower, the munitions, and the money. And what Washington would soon find out, those promises would ring hollow in many instances. As we all know, the war lasted for 8 long, grueling years. It was the longest war in our nation's history until Vietnam. Professor from the University of Southern California, Peter Mankow, tells us that Washington's victory over the English was the most improbable military victory in all of Western civilization.
So how did the Continental Army perform a seemingly impossible task? Well, Musser believes much of the credit goes to its commander-in-chief.
What was it about Washington that made him indispensable? Was he a brilliant military strategist of the ilk of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon? No. George Washington was a farmer. He would have said a planter. Today we say a farmer. He was not a military man. So what was it about Washington that made him so important? What these scholars tell us, it was his character, his sense of virtue that sets him apart from all others. When he was sworn in as commander-in-chief, George Washington refused a salary. Yes, he was offered a salary of $500 a month, a significant sum in those days. I cannot make a profit from this endeavor. He was willing to fight, but only for the worthiness of the cause, not for money. George Washington never took a day off. He was with his men during those grueling, freezing winters at Valley Forge, Morristown. The soldiers were freezing to death, literally. George Washington cared more about the safety and welfare of his men than he did himself. When in battle, when retreating from the English, as was often the case, Washington was in the rear, the most vulnerable of positions, making sure that his men were moving towards safety. And to say that he was courageous doesn't really do him justice. He was fearless in battle. The British redcoats were on one side and Washington's Continental Army on the other. They were a mere 100 feet apart, maybe the distance of our front yard, firing at each other with muskets. And the British were about to take the day. Washington is off to the side, astride his horse, watching the battle. And as his men began to retreat, he rides in on his horse. Thomas Jefferson tells us that George Washington was the greatest horseman of the age. He rides in between the competing forces. His only protection is the smoke from the musket fire. Hold your ground, my boys, hold your ground. There is but a handful of them. We can prevail. His men see his excellency in this state of peril, They halt, they turn, retrench, re-engage, and indeed they take the day. And we know about this in part because of a letter that one of Washington's fellow officers wrote, who bore witness to this scene, in which he tells his wife, "My dearly beloved, yesterday I witnessed such courage as I could never have imagined. His Excellency rode into the fire, 1,000 deaths flying all around him, his life hanging by a single hair. I assure you, my dear, I feared not for myself, but only for this bravest of all men." And in due time, the people of the United States began hearing and then understanding. And then they came to realize that Washington was one of the richest men in the colonies in the States. But this man was willing to risk every material thing that he held dear, his Mount Vernon, even his beloved Martha, and of course his own life, in the furtherance of a principle: liberty, freedom. Richest man in the colony risked everything for this cause.
A cause that is soon to turn to the birth of a new nation.